The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver, ghostly glow over the crumbling facades of the city. Its reflection danced across puddles in the cobblestone streets, a cruel, teasing mirror to the world of shadowed power and whispered secrets that lay ahead. In the distance, the faint toll of a bell marked the hour, midnight. For most, it was just time, but for her, it was the moment her fate would be sealed. Omega, a girl born to be underestimated, discarded by those who claimed to love her, and now sold to the highest bidder in a world that thrived on fear, dominance, and the subtle cruelty of wealth. She had been blindfolded for hours, carried through corridors of unknown dimensions, through back alleys and unlit roads. The coarse ropes on her wrists had left deep red impressions in her skin, and the ache in her muscles made her head spin. But her mind was sharp. Fear was an enemy she would not give victory to. Her gaze, even behind the blindfold, was unbroken, resolute. Omega had learned long ago that survival required more than obedience. It required cunning, patience, and a certain willingness to strike when the opportunity arose. A sharp hand grasped her shoulder and pulled her forward. "Not far now," a gruff voice whispered. "Remember your place." Omega said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. She did not need to answer. Words could betray more than silence ever could. The carriage door opened, spilling her into a chill night air that smelled of smoke, damp earth, and a faint metallic tang she could not place. The Say's outskirts were eerily silent, the cobblestones worn by centuries of footsteps, none of which were her own. Ahead, the silhouette of the auction house rose like a monolith from the darkness, tall, forbidding, its windows glowing faintly as if smoldering with secrets it had witnessed for decades. Inside, the room was alive with low murmurs, the scent of cologne, leather, and authority pressing against her senses. Alphas of every rank, every kind, filled the space, men and women whose reputations alone could terrify kingdoms. Their eyes were sharp, predatory, and they moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They were hunters in the purest sense, and she, Omega, had been cast into their arena as the prey. The auctioneer stepped forward, his voice a rasping melody that drew every ear. "Tonight, a rare opportunity presents itself," he announced, his eyes scanning the crowd like a hawk circling its prey. A young Omega, strong in spirit and resilient in body, awaits her new master. Only the highest bidder shall claim her. Step forward and prove your worth. Omega's heart pounded. She did not flinch, though every fiber of her being screamed for her to run, to hide, to scream. She knew, deep down, that no one could fear her even if she did. She had been discarded, sold like a commodity, and yet she refused to yield. Her mind raced, calculating possibilities. Escape seemed impossible, resistance dangerous, compliance unthinkable. Suddenly, the room fell into a hush, as if the air itself had frozen. Omega's gaze lifted, and she saw him. The Alpha King. He stepped forward from the shadows, tall, imposing, his presence alone demanding reverence. His eyes were sharp, calculating, yet there was something else there. A quiet intensity that unsettled the room and stirred something unfamiliar in her chest. He raised his hand slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had slowed to witness his action. The auctioneer's voice faltered, almost lost in the silence that followed. "The Alpha King bids." The words fell like thunder across the gloom. Other bidders hesitated, wary, cautious, as if even the idea of challenging the king was folly. Omega's breath caught. She had heard the stories, whispers in back alleys and crowded markets, of his unmatched dominance, of his brutal decisions, of the way he could bend wills without a word. And yet, when his eyes met hers, there was a strange recognition, a spark that neither fear nor submission could explain. The bidding continued, a tense, drawn-out dance of wealth and dominance. Each new figure who raised a hand or pressed a token forward felt smaller, less significant, as if the king's presence sucked the confidence from the air. His hand remained raised, unwavering, and with it came an unspoken command. This auction was his, and so too, perhaps, was the Omega who stood before the crowd. Finally, the gavel fell. Sold to the Alpha King. The echo of the sound resonated through the grand hall, a punctuation to an event none would forget. Gasps, murmurs, and whispers rippled through the room. Some feared him, others admired him, but all understood. The Omega now belonged to the one who could command kingdoms with a flick of his hand. Omega was moved forward by 2 towering guards, the eyes of every spectator upon her. She felt the weight of expectation, the silent judgment, and the invisible chains of destiny tightening around her shoulders. But she refused to bow her head. She refused to kneel. Her pride, fragile yet stubborn, burned brighter than any fear. The Alpha King finally approached the stage. His gaze lingered on her, and in it she saw not cruelty, but curiosity. "You are stronger than I imagined," he said, his voice low, resonant, carrying both authority and something else she could not yet name. "I am not a prize," Omega said, her voice steady, despite the fear clawing at her chest. He paused, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Perhaps not, but tonight you will learn the cost of survival." And with that, she was escorted from the stage, her blindfold replaced with shadows, her journey only beginning. The carriage that carried her through the night was silent, save for the occasional creak of wood and the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves against stone. Omega's mind raced. She considered every detail she had observed, every story she had ever heard of the Alpha King. Was he her captor, her protector, or something in between? The questions haunted her, and yet she found herself watching the shadows for more than threats, for hints of opportunity. Hours passed before the castle emerged from the mists like a dark sentinel. Its walls were tall and jagged, crowned with spires that seemed to pierce the sky. Windows glimmered with candlelight, but there was no warmth, only a sense of centuries-old vigilance. Here, Omega realized, was a world ruled by strength, cunning, and unyielding will. Inside, the corridors were vast and cold, lined with tapestries depicting battles and triumphs long past. Servants moved silently, their eyes wary, their steps careful. Omega felt the weight of observation pressing against her, but she walked with her head high. In her chamber, lavish yet oppressive, she finally allowed herself a moment of reflection. The walls seemed alive, the shadows whispering secrets she could not yet comprehend. She sat upon the bed, heart racing, mind spinning. Escape seemed impossible. Survival required calculation, patience, and a willingness to embrace the darkness. And somewhere beyond the stone walls, the Alpha King watched. Not with malice, not with cruelty, but with intent. He understood the fire in her spirit, the defiance she carried even in chains. And in that understanding lay the first spark of a connection neither could yet define. The midnight auction was over, but for Omega, the true ordeal was only beginning. And as the moonlight slanted across the cold stone floor, she realized this night would change her forever. The carriage rolled along the winding roads, its wheels groaning against the uneven stones as if protesting the weight of its passengers. Inside, Omega sat rigid, her hands bound loosely, but enough to remind her of the reality she could not yet escape. The blindfold from earlier had been removed, leaving her eyes open to a world both magnificent and terrifying. Outside the window, dense forests stretched endlessly, their twisted branches clawing at the mist like skeletal fingers. A cold wind whispered through the trees, carrying secrets and perhaps threats, she could not tell which. The Alpha King's presence was silent but palpable. He did not speak as the carriage moved, but Omega could feel his gaze like a weight pressing against her back, measuring her, assessing her. She wanted to retreat into herself, to pretend she was a stone statue that could neither feel nor act, but defiance stirred inside her like a quiet fire. She refused to submit entirely. Not yet. Finally, the carriage slowed, coming to a halt at the base of a towering fortress. Its walls seemed to scrape the sky, and its gates, carved from blackened iron, loomed like the jaws of a predator. The castle exuded power and intimidation, and for the first time, Omega felt the magnitude of the world she had been thrust into. It was not just an arena of alphas. It was a labyrinth of authority, intrigue, and danger. The doors opened with a slow, grinding groan. Servants in muted uniforms escorted her inside. Every footstep echoed off the stone, multiplying the tension in her chest. The hallways were lined with portraits of Alphas long deceased, each stare seeming to judge her for her weakness, her status as a commodity, her survival. Omega's stomach tightened as she realized the depth of history she had been forced into, one where she was not yet a player, only a pawn. Her chambers were vast, decorated with rich tapestries depicting victories, hunts, and conquests. Despite the lavishness, a chill lingered in the air. It smelled faintly of smoke, ink, and centuries-old stone. There was a desk with papers neatly arranged, a bed large enough to hold kings, and a fireplace cold and unlit. Omega approached the desk, her fingers brushing over the surface, noting the faint scratches and markings. Signs that countless others had occupied this room before her. Each mark told a story, and the weight of those stories were pressed down on her chest. Omega's thoughts were interrupted by the soft, deliberate footsteps behind her. She spun, ready to confront whoever dared enter, but the figure was familiar, the Alpha King. His expression unreadable, his presence as commanding as the walls themselves. "You have questions," he stated, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement of the obvious. "I have 100, Omega said, her voice firm despite the tight knot of fear in her stomach. "And you will not answer them all." He smiled faintly, a gesture that was almost warmth, almost cruelty. She could not tell which. "Perhaps not, but some answers you will need, and others you will discover on your own. That is the way of survival." Omega's eyes narrowed. "So I am to learn by watching, by guessing, by surviving traps and whispers?" "Exactly," he said. "Do you think the world cares about what is fair or just for an Omega? No, you must carve your path with cunning, courage, and whatever advantage you can find." A shiver ran down her spine, not from cold, but from the weight of his words. Omega had known danger before, but never like this, never at this scale. She realized that every movement she made, every thought she held, would be watched and interpreted. The castle was alive, a sentient maze of authority, secrecy, and power. That night, sleep was impossible. Omega lay on the vast bed, listening to the faint creaks of the castle settling, the whispers of unseen servants, and the distant howls of wolves from the forest beyond the walls. She considered escape, plotting routes, imagining possibilities, and calculating the risks. But the Alpha King's presence was a silent deterrent. Any rash move could provoke consequences she could not yet anticipate. By dawn, Omega had made her decision. She would not surrender to fear. She would learn, observe, and prepare. Every shadow, every whisper, every corridor would be her teacher. She would not be just an Omega to be sold or dominated. She would be a force. Her first trial came sooner than expected. Servants appeared, leading her through a series of dimly lit corridors toward the inner sanctum of the castle. "You are to be trained," one whispered, voice trembling, "for your own safety and for the king's satisfaction." Omega's stomach twisted. Training could mean survival, but it could also mean subjugation. The Alpha King met her in the training hall, a vast chamber lined with weapons, dummies, and mirrored walls. His eyes scanned her with an intensity that made her pulse race. "The world outside does not forgive weakness," he said. "Neither shall I. If you survive, it will be because you adapt. If you fail, you will be forgotten." The first exercise was deceptively simple. Balance and endurance. Omega ran the length of the hall, dodging slinging pendulums, leaping over wooden obstacles, her muscles screaming with exertion. The mirrors reflected not only her movements, but her mistakes, her hesitation, her misjudgments. Each error was noted by the Alpha King's silent gaze. "You are hesitant," he observed after an hour of relentless trials. "Do you fear me?" Omega paused, sweat dripping from her brow. "I do not fear you," she said, though a shiver of truth ran through her body. "I respect what you represent. Fear is something I save for fools." The Alpha King's lips curved into a small smile, sharp and fleeting. "Good," he said.
Respect and understanding will keep you alive longer than blind obedience. But remember, even respect can be dangerous in the wrong hands. Hours passed, blending training with observation. Omega's muscles burned, her lungs screamed for air, but her mind sharpened. With every task, every challenge, every assessment, she began to see patterns in the king's methods, subtle tests hidden within each maneuver, each observation. He was not simply teaching her skills. He was probing her, measuring her resilience, her adaptability, and, perhaps, her spirit. That night, Omega lay awake again, her body exhausted, but her mind alive. She replayed every movement, every glance, every word from the king. She realized that this castle, these trials, were not meant to break her, but to shape her into something stronger, something the Alpha King had chosen, perhaps not to dominate, but to forge.
And then came the whisper she had not expected, the hint of another presence, someone watching beyond the castle walls, waiting for a moment to strike. Omega's instincts sharpened. Survival was not only about strength or skill. It was about vigilance, about sensing danger before it arrived. By the time the first light of dawn seeped through the tall windows of the castle, Omega had made a silent vow. She would survive. She would endure. She would learn the secrets of this place, the strengths and weaknesses of the Alpha King, and the hidden dangers lurking in every shadow. The midnight auction had ended, but the real trial, the trial of shadows, survival, and cunning, had only begun. And somewhere in the castle's labyrinthine corridors, the Alpha King watched, silently approving her determination, recognizing a spark that could grow into a flame capable of challenging even his formidable will. The castle had a rhythm of its own, the creaking of ancient stone underfoot, the echo of unseen footsteps in corridors winding like veins through its massive heart, the faint hum of whispered secrets that never truly slept. For Omega, each day brought a new layer of tension, a new test, a new realization. She was no longer in the world she had known. Survival here demanded more than strength. It demanded cunning, patience, and the ability to anticipate danger before it arrived. The morning had barely begun when Omega was summoned to the inner courtyard. Mist rolled off the stone tiles like a living entity, curling around her ankles, hiding her steps, and adding an eerie chill to the dawn. The Alpha King awaited, standing near a massive archway she had never noticed before. It was covered in intricate carvings, serpents coiling around swords, eyes embedded in stone, symbols she could not decipher. The archway led to a door, black as night, with iron bindings that seemed to absorb the pale light. "This is the first true test," the Alpha King said, his voice low, measured, carrying both authority and challenge. "You will enter the labyrinth of shadows. It is not merely a maze, Omega. It is a place where illusions, traps, and your own fears will confront you at every turn. Only those who think, adapt, and endure may return. Fail, and the labyrinth keeps its secrets forever." Omega's heart raced. She had faced threats before, physical dangers, but the labyrinth was different. It was not just a structure, it was a living puzzle designed to test her mind, her instincts, and the resilience of her very soul. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and met his gaze. "I will return," she said, her voice steady, though her pulse thrummed like a drum in her ears. The Alpha King studied her for a long moment, his piercing eyes unreadable. "We shall see," he said finally. "Remember, fear is your ally if you understand it. Otherwise, it will be your end." The doors of the labyrinth opened like the maw of some great beast, revealing darkness so thick it seemed almost tangible. Omega stepped inside, and immediately the temperature dropped. The air felt heavy, pressing against her lungs, and shadows stretched and flickered as though alive, teasing her senses. The path ahead twisted unexpectedly, narrowing into corridors that seemed impossibly long, lined with mirrors that reflected not only her image, but distorted, nightmarish versions of herself. Her first encounter was immediate. Shadows detached from the walls, coalescing into humanoid shapes. They whispered her name, mocking her, echoing her fears. "You are weak. You will fail. You are nothing."
Omega's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to move forward, testing her instincts, watching the movement of the shadows. They mimicked her, copied her movements, but they could not think independently. She realized that observation and patience would be her key. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time felt meaningless in the labyrinth. She encountered traps that required agility, balance, and quick thinking. Pits concealed by illusionary stone, swinging blades that descended without warning, and pressure plates that triggered deadly mechanisms. Every step demanded precision. One false move could end her journey here, her story sealed forever in the darkness. Midway through the labyrinth, she stumbled upon a pool of water, black and still, reflecting nothing but shadows. As she knelt to drink, the water shimmered, revealing a vision. Herself, bound and broken, pleading, powerless. Omega's breath caught. It was a test of her mind as much as her body. She forced herself to look away, focusing on her reflection in the shards of bilgen stone scattered on the floor. "I am not that person," she whispered to herself. "I am stronger than fear." The deeper she went, the more the labyrinth seemed to respond to her thoughts. Corridors twisted, rooms shifted, illusions became more convincing. At one point, she found herself in a chamber where every wall was covered in eyes, staring at her, judging, analyzing. She felt naked under their gaze, every secret, every weakness exposed. Panic rose, but she clenched her fists, grounding herself. She had to remember, this was a test, not reality. Her next challenge was a confrontation with a guardian of the labyrinth. Unlike the shadows, it was tangible. A massive wolf, its fur black as midnight, eyes glowing like molten gold. Its movements were precise, deliberate, predatory. Omega knew instinctively that fighting it head-on would be suicide. She studied its patterns, predicting its lunges, dodging with skill born of desperation, and finally, with a well-timed strike using a shard of stone she had found, she wounded it enough to retreat past its path. The wolf did not follow, as if respecting her cunning. Hours blurred into exhaustion. Cuts and bruises marked her skin, her clothes torn and damp. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but there was no time to pause. She forced herself onward, trusting her instincts, trusting her mind. Every twist in the labyrinth was a puzzle, every shadow a potential threat. And through it all, she realized a strange truth. She was learning to think like the Alpha King. To anticipate, adapt, and dominate even in a situation designed to break her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached the heart of the labyrinth. The chamber was circular, illuminated by a shaft of pale moonlight, streaming through a small window high above. In the center lay a pedestal, and upon it, a single token, a symbol of passage, a mark of victory. Omega approached cautiously, aware that one wrong step could trigger another trap. She reached out and touched the token, and the labyrinth seemed to sigh, as if acknowledging her achievement. Exhausted, battered, but unbroken, she made her way back through the shifting corridors. The shadows whispered, but now their words felt hollow, powerless against the fire burning within her. She emerged from the labyrinth just as the first rays of dawn began. The Alpha King was waiting, as he had predicted. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, assessed her from a distance. "You have returned," he said, voice calm, yet carrying the weight of judgment. "Most would not have. Few Omegas survive even the first trial. You are exceptional." Omega's chest heaved. Sweat and grime streaked across her face. She met his gaze, defiance still blazing within her. "I am not exceptional," she said. "I am alive. That is all that matters." The Alpha King's lips curved into a small, almost approving smile. Alive and aware. That is more than many can claim. As she staggered back to her chambers, Omega knew one truth. The castle was more than a home, more than a prison. It was a crucible. And she had only just begun to forge herself into something the world would not ignore. But deep in the shadows of the castle, unseen eyes watched her every step. Allies and enemies alike, plotting, waiting for the moment to strike. Omega's trials were far from over, The labyrinth had tested her body, mind, and spirit, but the world outside and even within these walls promised greater dangers yet. And somewhere in the still corridors of the castle, the Alpha King observed silently. He had expected her to survive, but not with such fire, such cunning, such spark. Omega was no longer merely a commodity, a prize. She was becoming something far more dangerous. The sun rose fully, spilling light over the blackened stone walls, and for a brief moment, Omega allowed herself a single thought. She would not be broken. She would not be controlled. And she would survive, whatever the cost. The castle never truly slept. Even in the quietest hours of the night, when the moon was high and the corridors seemed empty, there was a rhythm, a pulse beneath the stone that spoke of watchful eyes and secrets long held. For Omega, who had survived the labyrinth of shadows, the castle had become both enemy and teacher. Every corner, every shadow, every flicker of candlelight held potential danger. But it also held knowledge, pieces of the puzzle she was only beginning to understand. Morning light filtered through the tall, narrow windows of her chambers, falling on the cold stone floors and painting the room in muted golds and silvers. Omega sat on the edge of the bed, muscles sore and bruised from the labyrinth, yet her mind raced faster than ever. Survival in the castle required more than physical endurance. It required observation, calculation, and sometimes cunning deception. The Alpha King had made one thing clear. Fear could not control her, but cleverness and vigilance would. Her morning began with a quiet observation of the castle's servants. They moved like shadows, hushed steps on stone, whispering in tones Omega could barely catch. There were rumors in their murmurs. Some spoke of the Alpha King's past victories, others of Omegas who had perished here, their names erased from memory. Omega's eyes traced every movement, noting the hierarchy, the alliances, the gestures and glances that hinted at unspoken loyalties. Knowledge, she realized, was the first weapon she would need. Before she could explore further, a sharp knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. The Alpha King entered without waiting for an invitation. His presence was commanding, yet there was an almost imperceptible softness in his expression. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition of her growing understanding. "You survived the labyrinth," he said, voice calm but edged with intrigue. "Few Omegas endure it, and even fewer emerge unbroken. But survival alone does not guarantee strength. The mind is tested long after the body recovers."
Omega rose, standing tall despite the lingering ache in her limbs. "I am learning faster than you think." Her voice carried both defiance and a hint of challenge. The Alpha King's gaze lingered on her, analyzing, assessing, yet not dismissing. "You are clever," he admitted, "but the castle holds more than corridors and shadows. It holds truths that some would kill to protect. Tonight, you will begin your lessons in understanding them." Before Omega could respond, the Alpha King gestured for her to follow. Together, they walked through corridors that twisted and turned like the coils of a serpent. Every stone, every carving, every archway seemed to whisper histories of battles, betrayals, and victories long past. Tapestries depicting ancient wars hung like silent sentinels, their threads worn but story preserved in meticulous detail. Omega traced her fingers lightly over one, noting the depiction of a fallen Omega among towering alphas, her eyes fierce even in death. The lesson was subtle but unmistakable. Strength alone was not enough. Knowledge, timing, and strategy could mean the difference between survival and oblivion. Their journey led them to the castle's library, a vast chamber, where towering shelves held volumes that smelled of parchment, dust, and centuries of secrets. Omega's eyes widened as she took in the collection. Histories of alpha lineages, maps of territories, records of past auctions, and even diaries of former Omegas who had survived, or failed. Here, knowledge was power, and Omega realized this was a battlefield in its own right. "Study carefully," the Alpha King instructed, his tone deceptively casual. "The castle is more than a fortress. It is a vault of truths. Each book, each record is a weapon. Learn to wield them wisely, or they will become chains around your neck."
Omega moved among the shelves, pulling volumes at random, skimming and absorbing and mentally cataloguing. One diary, worn and frayed, described an Omega who had navigated the castle's political games, forming alliances with loyal servants and exiles only to be betrayed by those she trusted most. Omega read the entries carefully, noting patterns in alliances, understanding how loyalty and fear intersected, and realizing that even in the castle, survival often depended on relationships as much as strength. As the sun climbed higher, casting narrow beams through stained glass windows, Omega paused to reflect. She was beginning to see the castle as more than a travel prison. It was a living entity, a place where every shadow, every corridor, every whisper could be turned to her advantage or against her. The Alpha King was testing her, yes, but he was also teaching her to navigate a world where danger lurked behind every corner. Her lessons were interrupted by a commotion outside the library doors. Shadows moved quickly, accompanied by muffled shouts. Omega's pulse quickened. She peeked through the narrow gap and saw two of the castle servants being dragged away by figures she did not recognize, cloaked, moving with lethal efficiency. Her instincts screamed at her. Danger, political intrigue, perhaps an attack. Without hesitation, she slipped from the library, keek into the shadows, and followed at a distance. The chase led her to the castle's lower levels, corridors she had never seen, damp and cold, with walls slick with condensation. She ducked behind a pillar and watched as the cloaked figures entered a chamber, their voices low but urgent. "A Alpha King cannot be allowed to claim her," one whispered. "She holds knowledge he cannot ignore. She must be removed."
Omega's mind raced. Knowledge, danger, betrayal. The labyrinth had tested her physically and mentally, but now the stakes had risen. The castle was no longer simply a test of endurance or cunning. It had become a battleground of shadows, deception, and lethal politics. One wrong move could cost her life. She realized with a cold clarity that she could not rely solely on the Alpha King. He might be her protector, or he might be a rival to those who wished her harm. But in the end, survival was her responsibility alone. Omega's pulse steadied. Fear could be useful if harnessed correctly. Otherwise, it was a trap. She would not allow herself to fall into it. Over the next hours, Omega observed, traced movements, memorized corridors, and even intercepted minor communications among the servants. Each piece of information added to a growing map in her mind, revealing patterns, potential allies, and threats she could exploit. The castle, she realized, was not merely stone and mortar. It was a chessboard, and she was learning to play, one cautious step at a time. By nightfall, the Alpha King returned to her chambers. His presence, once intimidating, now carried a subtle approval. "You have been busy," he remarked, voice calm, but with an edge that hinted he knew more than he let on. "I am learning," Omega replied, choosing her words carefully. "The castle is more than walls. It is a puzzle, and I intend to solve it." The Alpha King's eyes gleamed faintly in the torchlight. "Good. But remember this. Not all puzzles are meant to be solved, and not all knowledge brings freedom. Some truths are dangerous. Omega, handle them wisely." As the night deepened, Omega lay awake in her chamber, the fire in the hearth long extinguished. Her mind replayed the day's discoveries, the whispers, the shadows, and the hidden corridors. She had survived the labyrinth of shadows, navigated the castle's secrets, and begun to understand the subtle power of knowledge. But she also knew the true trials were only beginning. Allies could become enemies, shadows could become traps, and even the Alpha King, enigmatic, commanding, and dangerous, remained a puzzle she had yet to fully decipher. Yet, beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion, there was a spark. Omega's defiance, intelligence, and growing understanding were becoming weapons in their own right. She was no longer simply an Omega to be bought, sold, or controlled. She was becoming a force capable of surviving and shaping her destiny even within the castle's oppressive walls. Outside, the castle loomed, silent and watchful. While inside, Omega made a vow to herself. No matter the dangers, no matter the shadows, no matter the traps or enemies that lay ahead, she would not be broken. She would uncover the secrets of the castle, survive the politics, and carve a path through the darkness. One step, one shadow, and one truth at a time. And somewhere, in the silent corridors beyond her chamber, unseen eyes observed her resolve,
measuring her strength, testing her endurance, and perhaps acknowledging the first stirrings of a power that could rival even the Alpha King himself. The castle's stone corridors had grown familiar to Omega, yet their familiarity offered no comfort. Every echo, every flicker of torchlight, every subtle movement of a servant or shadowed figure reminded her that within these walls, danger was never far. She had survived the labyrinth, uncovered fragments of the castle's secrets, and learned to read patterns in its whispers. But survival was a fragile illusion. Trust was a currency in short supply, and enemies hid where the light could not reach. The day began with an unusual calm. Morning light spilled across the marble floors, gilding the tall, arched windows with a soft glow. Birds, impossibly unaware of the castle's deadly hierarchy, chirped somewhere beyond the walls. Omega had taken to walking the corridors during these early hours, observing the servants, the guards, even the shadows themselves. Every glance, every gesture told a story, if one was willing to listen.
Yet calm is often the precursor to chaos, and Omega knew it. She had barely finished her morning exercises when she noticed something out of place. A servant she had not seen before, a tall man whose eyes darted nervously, whose hands fidgeted with a knife hidden beneath his robe. He smiled politely, but the tension radiating from him was impossible to hide. Omega's instinct screamed. Danger, subterfuge, betrayal. The man approached, bowing slightly. "My lady," he said, voice honeyed smooth. "I have been assigned to attend to you today. Your needs, your instructions, I am here." Omega studied him carefully, noting every detail, the angle of his shoulder, the restless flick of his eyes, the way his hand brushed the dagger. Nothing about him was innocent. "Assigned I whom?" she asked, her voice steady but cold. "The castle," he said, almost faltering. "And by the king himself?" Omega's brow furrowed. The Alpha King's commands were always precise. He would not assign someone without purpose. But something about this man screamed falsehood. She allowed him to accompany her down a corridor, all the while calculating, observing, memorizing his patterns. Every step was measured, her mind racing through possibilities. It was when they reached the courtyard, where the mist clung like living smoke, that the betrayal became undeniable. With a sudden swift motion, the man lunged, knife aimed for her side. Omega twisted instinctively, narrowly avoiding the blade, her own hands reaching for a nearby stone. The man's surprise was fleeting. He was trained and skilled, but Omega's reflexes, sharpened through the labyrinth and castle strawls, were faster. A tense fight erupted. Knife clashed against stone, and Omega docked beneath another strike, rolling across the wet cobblestones. The mist wrapped around them, hiding movements, amplifying tension. Every second was a dance of life and death. Omega realized quickly, this was not a random attack. The man had knowledge of the castle, of her routines, perhaps even of the Alpha King's own habits. As the struggle continued, Omega exploited a brief misstep. She struck his wrist with a heavy stone, sending the knife clattering across the floor. The man cursed, lunging at her again, but she was prepared. Using his momentum, she twisted, sending him sprawling into the fountain at the courtyard center. Water splashed over both of them, but Omega's mind was clear. She had survived this betrayal. But the danger was far from over. Breathing heavily, she retrieved the knife, keeping it ready. Her eyes scanned the mist, noting the darkened corners, the shadowed alleys, the servants who had stopped to watch, feigning ignorance. The castle was a living entity, she realized, and it was watching her as much as she watched it. Every movement was calculated, every whisper analyzed, every shadow considered a potential threat. The man rose slowly, glaring at her with hatred and fear. "You think you can survive here?" he spat, water dripping from his hair. "You are nothing." Omega stepped closer, voice calm but deadly. "I am not nothing, and you will regret underestimating me." The man hesitated, then fled into the misted corridors, leaving Omega alone in the courtyard. Her senses sharpened, her pulse still racing. She knew this was just a fragment of the threats to come. That lurked within the castle walls. There were others. Enemies she had not yet seen, plotting in the shadows,
waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By evening, Omega had traced the path of her attacker through the castle's lower levels. She discovered hidden passages, secret doors, and corridors not even marked on the castle's maps. Each revelation brought both understanding and unease. The castle was full of secrets, and some of them were lethal. She realized the Alpha King's lessons were far from over. This was not only training, it was a survival guide delivered in blood and deception. That night, as she returned to her chambers, Omega reflected on the events of the day. Survival required not just strength or agility, but perception. Every ally could be a traitor, every servant could be an assassin, and even familiar corridors could harbor death. She had learned to trust no one completely, except herself. Her reflection in the chamber's mirror was haunted, yet resolute. The faint scars along her arms, the bruises ballooning across her ribs were proof of her resilience, and yet the fire in her eyes was undiminished. Omega's mind was already plotting for tomorrow. New routines, new strategies, and ways to turn the castle's treacheries into her advantage. The Alpha King arrived quietly later that night. He did not speak immediately, watching her from the doorway, as if reading the battle she had just endured. "You were challenged," he stated simply. "I survived," Omega replied. He nodded slowly, his gaze unreadable. "Good, but remember this. Survival is not merely enduring a fight. It is understanding the motivations, the threats, and the minds around you. You are beginning to grasp this, but the castle will continue to test you. More than once, you will find that betrayal can come from where you least expect." Omega met his gaze steadily. "Then I will be ready. Always." He did not respond with words, only a small approving nod before disappearing back into the corridors, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The castle was alive with shadows, whispers, and secrets, but for the first time, Omega realized that she was becoming a force to be reckoned with. Each betrayal, each challenge, was a step toward power. Power not given, but seized. As the night deepened, the corridors settled into an eerie quiet, and Omega lay on her bed, bruised and aching, but alive. The fire in her chest burned brighter than ever. She had survived the labyrinth, navigated the castle's secrets, and endured betrayal. But tomorrow would bring new tests, new dangers, and new revelations. And somewhere in the castle, hidden eyes watched her resolve. The Alpha King, the mysterious servants, the cloaked figures lurking in shadows, all recognized one truth. Omega was no longer merely an Omega to be sold or dominated. She was becoming a player in the deadly game of power within the castle walls. The castle had changed, or perhaps it was Omega who had changed. Every stone, every echo, every flicker of torchlight now carried meaning. Each hallway was no longer just a passage, but a battlefield of observation and calculation. After surviving the labyrinth and enduring betrayal, Omega's senses had sharpened. Her mind expanded to anticipate danger before it arrived. Yet the castle had depths she had not yet begun to fathom.
The castle had changed. Or perhaps it was Omega who had changed. Every stone, every echo, every flicker of torchlight now carried meaning. Each hallway was no longer just a passage, but a battlefield of observation and calculation. After surviving the labyrinth and enduring betrayal, Omega's senses had sharpened. Her mind expanded to anticipate danger before it arrived. Yet the castle had depths she had not yet begun to fathom. Alliances had risen and fallen, victims of ambition, jealousy, and secrecy. Each revelation sharpened her understanding. The morning air was thick with mist, curling around the spires like living fingers. Omega moved silently through the corridors, her footsteps measured, her senses alert. The events of the previous day lingered. The betrayal, the near-death confrontation, the hidden passages she'd had uncovered. Knowledge, she realized, was both her weapon and her shield, and the castle held more secrets than she could ever hope to learn in a single day. As she walked, she noticed subtle changes.
guards exchanging glances she had not seen before, whispers too hushed to catch, yet heavy with intent, the scent of incense that hinted at rituals or hidden councils. The castle was alive, yes, but not merely as stone and mortar. It was alive in its politics, its alliances, its betrayals. Omega understood now that survival meant mastering not just herself, but the entire network of power woven throughout these walls. Her journey led her to the castle's grand hall, a place where decisions were made, alliances formed, and rivalries sharpened like blades. Today, the hall was alive with movement. Not the usual guards and servants, but figures cloaked in silence, each representing factions within the castle, each with a stake in the web of power. Omega hid in the shadows, observing. Every gesture, every nod, every lowered glance was a thread in a complex tapestry of influence. She recognized some of the faces from the whispers she had overheard. A lieutenant of the Alpha King, whose loyalty was rumored to waver, a merchant with ties to the shadow markets, and a young strategist who had once served an exiled Alpha. They spoke in hushed tones, plotting, bargaining, maneuvering, and Omega listened, her mind absorbing every fragment. It was then that a sudden movement caught her eye, a young woman, barely older than Omega herself, who slipped past the group unnoticed. Her eyes met Omega's briefly, a flicker of recognition and something else, a warning, or perhaps an invitation. Omega followed, careful to stay unseen. The young woman led her to a hidden staircase, one of those passages the castle seemed to create only for those who knew its secrets. At the bottom, a chamber opened, filled with maps, documents, and artifacts long forgotten. Candlelight flickered across the walls, illuminating symbols and writings Omega could barely decipher. The young woman turned to her, voice barely above a whisper. "You have survived more than anyone expected. But survival here, it is only the beginning. There are factions, conspiracies, and enemies who will use you as a pawn unless you learn to play the game." Omega's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" "A friend if you choose wisely," the woman replied. "And you must choose carefully. The Alpha King is not the only power here. Shadows move unseen, alliances shift, and betrayal is never far. You need allies, or you will be destroyed." The chamber was silent for a moment, broken only by the soft rustle of parchment. Omega considered her options. Trust had been a deadly gamble already. Yet the spark in the young woman's eyes was undeniable. Knowledge, experience, and perhaps the chance to understand the castle's labyrinthine politics. "I will listen," Omega said finally, "but only as an equal. Deception will not save you here." The young woman smiled faintly. Wise. The castle rewards wisdom and punishes naivety. For hours, they studied the maps and documents. Omega learned of hidden chambers, secret tunnels, and passages that allowed unseen movement through the castle. She discovered records of past betrayals, detailing how Alphas and Omegas navigated this perilous domain, each step bringing her closer to an understanding of the dangerous world she now inhabited. By evening, Omega had begun to craft a plan. She would observe, align, and strike with precision. Every shadow could be an ally or a threat. Every whispered conversation held meaning. She understood now that survival required not just strength or cunning, but a mastery of perception. To navigate this castle, she had to think several steps ahead of everyone else, including the Alpha King. But knowledge came at a price. The castle's labyrinthine passages and hidden chambers held dangers beyond human comprehension. Some rooms were traps, designed to test loyalty, strength, and intelligence. Others were sanctuaries, places where secrets could be uncovered safely. Omega had to distinguish between the two, relying on instinct, intellect, and the lessons she had learned from the labyrinth. As night fell, the castle seemed to close in around her. Shadows stretched unnaturally, corridors twisted, and the air grew thick with anticipation. Omega moved silently, following the hidden passages she had mapped in her mind. She reached a secluded balcony overlooking the castle's inner courtyard. From this vantage point, she could see movement below. Guards changing shifts, servants whispering, and in the distance, figures cloaked in shadow, gathering with intent unknown. Omega's thoughts turned to the Alpha King. He had been her captor, her mentor, and perhaps the only constant in this ever-shifting environment. Yet even he was a mystery, his motives as intricate as the castle itself. She could not predict him, nor could she afford to underestimate him. Every action, every glance, every word carried weight. Suddenly, a shadow detached from the others and moved toward the outer gate. Omega followed silently, her pulse quickening. The figure was fast, deliberate, a master of stealth. As she crept closer, she recognized the same man who had attempted to betray her days before. But now he was not alone. 2 others accompanied him, each armed and ready, eyes gleaming with intent. Omega realized with a jolt. This was no random attack. It was a coordinated strike, an attempt to infiltrate the castle, or abduct her, or perhaps both. Her mind raced, calculating possibilities, escape routes, and strategies. She could not confront them head-on. The odds were against her. She needed leverage, intelligence, and timing. She moved swiftly through the shadows, following them to the secret tunnels she had discovered. Every step required precision, every breath measured. Omega understood now that the castle itself was her ally if she learned its rhythms, its patterns, and its hidden paths. She positioned herself at a narrow passage, ready to ambush, observe, and act. Hours passed in tense anticipation. The figures paused, speaking in hushed tones, their plans unfolding in fragmented phrases. Omega's mind cataloged every detail, their numbers, weapons, and intentions. She realized the depth of the conspiracy. There were those who sought to destabilize the Alpha King, to use her as a pawn in a larger game of power, and she was at the center of it all. When the moment arrived, Omega struck with precision. Using shadows, misdirection, and her growing mastery of stealth, she incapacitated one figure silently, then another, before retreating into the labyrinth of tunnels. Her movements were fluid, deliberate, and calculated. Survival was no longer about brute force, but intelligence, timing, and adaptability. By the time she returned to her chambers, the castle was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But Omega knew the truth. The web of shadows had only begun to entangle her. Betrayal, conspiracy, and danger were constants here, and each new day brought new challenges. Lying on her bed, bruised but unbroken, Omega reflected on the day's events. She had survived the labyrinth, uncovered the castle's secrets, and thwarted a coordinated attack. She had formed tentative alliances and learned to navigate the dangerous currents of power within these walls. Yet she also knew the stakes were rising. Every ally could be a traitor. Every shadow could conceal danger, and even the Alpha King remained a mystery whose intentions were as unpredictable as the castle itself. One thought burned brighter than any fear. She would survive. She would adapt, observe, and strike when necessary. The castle might be alive, full of shadows and secrets, but so was she. More alive, more cunning, and more determined than ever. Outside, the night deepened, the moon casting silver light over the castle's blackened stone. Somewhere in the shadows, unseen eyes watched, measuring her resolve, testing her strength, and acknowledging the spark of power that could rival even the Alpha King. The castle's walls seemed to pulse with hidden energy, as if the stone itself remembered every betrayal, every alliance, every secret that had ever passed through its corridors. For Omega, the walls were no longer mere stone. They were a living map of power, danger, and opportunity. Every shadow whispered threats. Every flickering torch carried potential revelations, and every door could conceal either salvation or peril. Morning broke with an unusual intensity. Sunlight pierced the narrow windows, striking the polished stone floors and creating long streaks of gold that danced like living spirits. Omega had been away for hours, meditating, observing the servants' routines, and tracing the movements of the Alpha King from her hidden vantage points. She was learning faster than even she realized. Every glance, every gesture, every conversation was a piece of the puzzle. And she was beginning to see the larger design. The Alpha King summoned her to the Hall of Mirrors. The room was massive, with ceilings so high that they seemed to vanish into darkness. Mirrors lined every wall, Their surface is flawless and infinite, reflecting Omega's own image back at her, multiplied dozens of times. The reflections were disorienting, yet instructive. Every hesitation, every twitch, every subtle movement she made was visible from countless angles. The hall was not just a room, it was a test.
"You have grown stronger," the Alpha King said, appearing behind her as silently as a shadow. "But strength alone will not ensure survival here. Wisdom, perception, and judgment will determine your fate." Omega turned to face him, her eyes steady, her body tense with anticipation. "I am ready for whatever you test me with," she said. The Alpha King's gaze lingered, unreadable, yet calculating. "Good," he replied. "Today, your trial is not physical. It is a test of perception, loyalty, and courage. The castle is full of allies and enemies alike. You must discern which is which. One wrong choice, one misplaced trust, and you will not only fail this test, you will invite danger upon yourself." The Alpha King's words hung in the air, heavy with menace and meaning. Omega understood that this was more than a game. It was a lesson in survival, a test of her ability to navigate the labyrinthine web of the castle's politics and hidden threats. The trial began with a simple instruction: follow the path, observe carefully, and uncover the hidden agents operating within the castle. Omega moved through the corridors, shadows clinging to her like a second skin. She noted subtle details: a servant whose movements were too precise, a guard whose eyes lingered a fraction too long, a shadow shifting against the wall in ways that betrayed intention. Each observation added another piece into the complex puzzle she was tasked to solve. Hours passed in tense observation. Omega encountered subtle traps, messages hidden in the walls, objects that revealed secret passages, and whispers designed to mislead. She had learned to interpret the castle's signs, but even she could not predict every turn. At one point, a servant approached with a tray of food, smiling warmly. Omega's instincts screamed caution. A careful inspection revealed a hidden blade beneath the plate. She removed it silently, her mind cataloging the threat while maintaining the appearance of obedience. As the day progressed, Omega's perceptions grew sharper. She identified a network of spies and informants operating within the castle, their loyalties divided and dangerous. Some sought to undermine the Alpha King, others plotted to manipulate her for their own ends. She realized that survival here demanded not only skill and strength, but also strategic thinking, the ability to anticipate betrayal and turn it to advantage. The Alpha King observed silently from the shadows, evaluating her choices, her judgments, and her instincts. Omega sensed his presence like a constant weight, neither threatening nor comforting, but ever present. He did not intervene, allowing her to navigate the dangers alone, to test her judgment and resourcefulness. By nightfall, Omega had completed the trial. She had uncovered a conspiracy to infiltrate the Alpha King's inner circle, neutralized subtle threats, and secured the loyalty of key servants. Each action required precision, timing, and a careful balance of deception and strategy. The castle, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become a canvas upon which she painted her growing mastery of survival and influence. The Alpha King approached her as she returned to her chambers. His expression was calm, yet his eyes gleamed with approval. "You have done well," he said. "Not because you are the strongest, but because you are perceptive, patient, and cunning. These qualities will serve you better than brute force ever could." Omega bowed slightly, acknowledging his words. "I have learned from the castle itself," she replied, "and from its lessons I will grow stronger." The Alpha King's gaze softened just slightly, as if recognizing her determination. "Remember this: knowledge and perception are as lethal as any weapon, but do not grow complacent. The castle, the shadows, and those who dwell within them will continue to test you. You are only beginning." Careful inspection revealed a hidden blade beneath the plate. She removed it silently, her mind cataloging the threat while maintaining the appearance of obedience. As the day progressed, Omega's perceptions grew sharper. She identified a network of spies and informants operating within the castle, their loyalties divided and dangerous. Some sought to undermine the Alpha King. Others plotted to manipulate her for their own ends. She realized that survival here demanded not only skill and strength, but also strategic thinking, the ability to anticipate betrayal and turn it to advantage. The Alpha King observed silently from the shadows, evaluating her choices, her judgments, and her instincts. Omega sensed his presence like a constant weight, neither threatening nor comforting, but ever present. He did not intervene, allowing her to navigate the dangers alone, to test her judgment and resourcefulness. By nightfall, Omega had completed the trial. She had uncovered a conspiracy to infiltrate the Alpha King's inner circle, neutralized subtle threats, and secured the loyalty of key servants. Each action required precision, timing, and a careful balance of deception and strategy. The castle, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become a canvas upon which she painted her growing mastery of survival and influence. The Alpha King approached her as she returned to her chambers. His expression was calm, yet his eyes gleamed with approval. "You have done well," he said. "Not because you are the strongest, but because you are perceptive, patient, and cunning. These qualities will serve you better than brute force ever could." Omega bowed slightly, acknowledging his words. "I have learned from the castle itself," she replied, "and from its lessons I will grow stronger." The Alpha King's gaze softened, just slightly, as if recognizing his determination. "Remember this. Knowledge and perception are as lethal as any weapon. But do not grow complacent. The castle, the shadows, and those who dwell within them will continue to test you. You are only beginning to understand the depth of danger here." Alone in her chambers, Omega reflected on the day's events. She had survived physical trials, navigated the labyrinth, uncovered betrayal, and now mastered perception and strategy. Each challenge had honed her mind, sharpened her instincts, and strengthened her resolve. Yet she knew the true trials were only beginning. Allies could betray, shadows could conceal death, and the Alpha King's intentions remained a puzzle now she had yet to solve. She sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the castle's towers. Its pale light bathed the stone in silver, highlighting the spires and battlements. Somewhere in the darkness, unseen forces plotted, whispered, and waited. Omega's mind cataloged each possibility, each potential threat, and each strategy to counter them. She realized that power here was not taken by force alone. It was earned through intelligence, observation, and careful maneuvering. As sleep approached, Omega made a silent vow. She would survive, no matter the cost. She would learn the castle's secrets, uncover its conspiracies, and navigate its web of power with cunning and precision. And she would not allow anyone, not even the Alpha King, to underestimate her. Somewhere in the castle, the Alpha King watched silently, measuring her growth, noting her determination, and recognizing that Omega was no longer merely a pawn. She was becoming a force capable of shaping the fate of the castle itself. Force capable of shaping the fate of the castle itself. The castle seemed to breathe. Every stone, every corridor, every flicker of torchlight carried a weight that pressed on Omega's senses, sharpening her awareness with every step. The labyrinth, the betrayals, and the subtle political intrigues had shaped her into a creature of observation and strategy. Yet she knew that the true test of her cunning had only begun. The day began with a summons from the Alpha King himself. The message was delivered in a silent whisper by a cloaked servant, his eyes avoiding hers, his steps light as mist over the stone floors. The words carried weight. "Come to the throne room at dusk. Your presence is required." Omega's pulse quickened. The throne room was a place of judgment, power, and secrecy. Every visitor entering its massive doors was measured and analyzed, their intentions dissected. Few emerged unchanged. For Omega, it would be another test, not of strength, not merely of intelligence, but of composure, of knowing when to act and when to remain unseen. Hours before the meeting,
Omega moved through the castle in her usual silent observation. She noticed subtle movements she had not before. A servant pausing too long near a tapestry, guards exchanging glances that betrayed unspoken orders, and a corridor where shadows seemed to move independently, as if alive. The castle was alive with whispers, each one carrying hidden meaning, and Omega catalogued every detail, every nuance. By the time she approached the throne room, dusk had settled over the castle, casting the walls in hues of copper and violet. The massive doors, etched with ancient runes and symbols of power, loomed before her. As she entered, the vast chamber swallowed her in silence, and the first thing she noticed was the gathering of figures within, a mix of trusted lieutenants, loyal servants, and individuals whose loyalty was uncertain at best. The Alpha King sat at the head of the throne, his presence commanding, yet layered with a subtle air of unpredictability. Omega could feel the weight of his gaze even from across the room. His eyes, sharp as daggers, measured every posture, every expression, every hesitation. This was more than a summons. It was a trial of composure and perception. "You have learned much," the Alpha King said, his voice smooth yet layered with authority. "You have navigated the labyrinth, survived betrayal, and observed the currents of power within these walls. But observation alone is not enough. Today, you will act. Today, you will make choices that will reveal both your loyalty and your cunning." Omega's eyes swept across the room. She noted subtle cues, a slight shift of a shoulder indicating nervousness, a fleeting glance exchanged between two figures, the way a hand hovered near a concealed weapon. Every detail mattered. Every gesture could be interpreted as ally or enemy, and every misstep could be fatal. The Alpha King's challenge was clear. He would test her ability to discern friend from foe, to navigate threats, and to manipulate information without revealing her intentions. The first test came swiftly. A servant approached, presenting a sealed scroll. Omega was instructed to read it aloud.
The scroll contained information of a planned betrayal. A group intending to undermine the Alpha King's authority can remove key figures from positions of power. Yet the names were incomplete, the details fragmentary. Omega immediately recognized that this was intentional, a test to see whether she would act rashly or analyze the information carefully. Silently, she cataloged every detail, cross-referenced it with her observations over the past weeks, and identified the likely conspirators. Two figures in the room, previously appearing innocuous, shifted subtly. Their expressions betrayed tension, though they attempted to mask it with composure. Omega noted them carefully, committing their positions, gestures, and interactions to memory. The Alpha King's gaze never wavered. "Act if you must," he said softly. "But remember, misjudgment has consequences." Omega waited, observing the room. Then, with deliberate precision, she whispered instructions to two of the Alpha King's most trusted lieutenants. Her voice was soft, controlled, yet every word carried meaning. She had deduced the conspirators, predicted their movements, and devised a method to expose them without compromising her position or loyalty. Minutes later, chaos erupted in a controlled storm. The conspirators were confronted, their intentions revealed through evidence, their gestures and words betraying the plans they had tried to conceal. Omega remained composed, her presence silent yet authoritative, guiding the resolution without revealing herself as the architect of the exposure. The Alpha King's eyes glimmered with approval. "You see," he said, voice calm yet carrying sharpness, "the mind can be a more lethal weapon than any blade. You have acted wisely, observed carefully, and influenced outcomes without appearing to do so. That is power." Omega's chest rose and fell steadily. She had succeeded, but the thrill of victory was tempered by caution. The castle was a web of alliances, conspiracies, and shifting loyalties. Every victory was temporary, every ally potentially dangerous, and every shadow a possible threat.
As the throne room emptied and the conspirators were removed, Omega remained behind, observing the Alpha King. His expression was unreadable, but there was an intensity in his gaze, a mixture of approval, challenge, and something deeper, something that hinted at a game that extended far beyond what Omega could not comprehend. That night, she returned to her chambers, her mind alive with strategies, observations, and questions. The castle was no longer merely a place of survival. It was a complex chessboard, each piece, servant, soldier, ally, or enemy, moving according to hidden rules. Omega realized that she had begun to understand these rules. Yet she also understood that the stakes were higher than ever.
Sleep did not come easily. Omega's mind replayed every detail of the day. The subtle gestures, the whispers, the shifting alliances, and the Alpha King's silent evaluations. She knew that the challenges would continue, that every shadow could conceal danger, and that her survival depended on constant vigilance, intelligence, and careful maneuvering. And somewhere in the vast corridors of the castle, hidden eyes watched her resolve. The Alpha King measured her growth, noting her composure, cunning, and strategic mind. He knew that Omega was no longer simply a pawn to be manipulated. She was a player, capable of navigating the shadows, influencing events, and asserting her presence in ways that could rival even his own. The castle held its secrets, its dangers, and its power. But Omega had begun to wield them, turning observation into strategy, vigilance into authority, and intelligence into survival. The shadows whispered around her, carrying both threats and possibilities, and she understood one immutable truth. She would survive, adapt, and master this castle, no matter the cost. As the moon rose high, casting silver light across the battlements, Omega stood by her window, her reflection merging with the shadows that clung to the walls. The castle's web of conspiracies, loyalties, and threats had tightened, yet she felt the surge of clarity and power. She was no longer merely an Omega. She was a force to be reckoned with. The castle was quiet, deceptively quiet. Every stone seemed to absorb the stillness, every corridor stretching into darkness, every flicker of torchlight a silent observer. For Omega, the stillness was never a comfort. It was a prelude to action, a sign that the shadows were moving and plotting, that the whispers she had learned to detect were intensifying. Tonight, she knew instinctively the castle itself would challenge her, not with riddles or secrets, but with raw confrontation. She moved silently through the halls, her senses sharpened from weeks of training, observation, and survival. Every step was calculated, every breath controlled, every shadow scanned for hidden threats. The Alpha King had sent no summons, issued no warnings, yet Omega could feel the tension in the air, the invisible currents of power and danger converging toward a point she could not yet see. Her journey led her to the castle's inner courtyard. The moonlight poured down, illuminating the cold stone in pale silver. Mist clung to the ground, swirling around the fountain and the statues of past rulers, creating ghostly shapes that seemed almost alive. Omega paused, listening. Footsteps echoed faintly from the corridor above, deliberate, measured. She was not alone. From the shadows emerged a figure she had not seen before, cloaked in darkness, mask concealing a face. The air shifted as the figure moved closer, each step deliberate, almost predatory. Omega's hand went instinctively to the dagger she had kept at her side, but she did not strike yet. Observation came first, always first. "You've been busy," the figure said, voice low, smooth, and dangerous. "Watching, learning, manipulating." Omega's eyes narrowed. "And you are?" The figure paused, tilting their head slightly. "A friend or an enemy? That depends on how you respond. But know this, the castle has not yet revealed all its games. Tonight, some truths must be faced inequity." Every shadow, every flicker of torchlight, every subtle movement of the servants or guards was catalogued in her mind. Nothing escaped her attention. Months of survival, observation, and strategic maneuvering had prepared her for this final confrontation. She had learned the rhythms of the castle, the hidden motives of those within it, and the unpredictable will of the Alpha King himself. Tonight, all of it would converge. The throne room awaited her. Massive doors, etched with ancient sigils and crowned with centuries of authority, loomed ahead. Omega's reflection shimmered faintly in the polished stone floor as she approached, her eyes steady, her posture commanding. This room had been a site of tests, betrayals, and revelations, but tonight it would witness her ascension. As she entered, the Alpha King rose from his throne, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betraying a mixture of respect, curiosity, and caution. The room was filled with assembled figures, loyalists who had endured alongside her, former conspirators now subdued by her intelligence and strategy, and those who had remained neutral, waiting to see which side would claim victory in the silent war of power. "You have grown," the Alpha King said, his voice calm yet weighted with authority. "From the labyrinth to betrayal, from shadowed corridors to confrontation, you have proven yourself in ways few could even comprehend. But the true test is now. The castle, its secrets, and its people will judge you as I have. Will you rise, or will you falter at the precipice of destiny?" Omega's gaze swept across the room. Every pair of eyes she met carried judgment, expectation, and fear. She understood that her ascension was not simply about survival. It was about earning authority, commanding respect, and mastering every aspect of this treacherous environment. And she would not falter. The first challenge came swiftly. A conspirator, one who had feigned loyalty for months, stepped forward, weapon drawn, intent clear in every movement. Omega's instincts took over. With the precision honed through countless encounters, she disarmed him, moving with fluid grace that was both mesmerizing and deadly. The crowd watched in tense silence, their breaths held as she neutralized threat after threat, not with indiscriminate violence, but with calculated control. The Alpha King observed quietly, noting each maneuver, each decision, each measure of composure. He had created trials of perception, betrayal, and confrontation. But this was different. This was recognition of Omega's mastery of the castle itself. As the confrontation reached its peak, a new threat emerged. Not physical, but political. Figures who had long plotted in the shadows, seeking to destabilize the Alpha King's authority, attempted to sway the assembly against Omega. But she was prepared. Using her deep understanding of alliances, motivations, and secrets, she exposed their schemes with meticulous precision. Every hidden whisper, every veiled threat, every subtle manipulation was revealed and neutralized, leaving the conspirators with no path to influence. The room erupted into a tense silence as Omega turned her gaze back to the Alpha King. She had survived the labyrinth, the betrayals, the conspiracies, and the direct confrontations. She had mastered perception, strategy, and combat. She had turned shadows into allies, threats into lessons, and danger into advantage. And now she stood not merely as a survivor, but as a force capable of shaping the destiny of the castle itself. The Alpha King's voice broke the silence. "You have done more than survive. You have mastered the elements of power, the currents of loyalty, and the dangers of the unseen. You are no longer merely an Omega. You are a leader, a strategist, and a force that commands both respect and fear. The castle recognizes this, and so do I." He rose fully from the throne, stepping forward, and for the first time, there was no veiled challenge in his gaze, only recognition. "From this night onward, the power within these walls is shared. You have earned it through every trial, every choice, every battle. The castle's shadows are yours to command as much as mine, and together we will ensure its strength endures." Omega stepped forward, her chest rising with confidence, her eyes ablaze with resolve. She had faced every danger, every betrayal, and every challenge the castle had thrown at her. Now she will step into her rightful place, not as a pawn, not as a subordinate, but as an equal, a leader whose presence could reshape destiny. Every shadow, every flicker of torchlight, every subtle movement of the servants or guards was catalogued in her mind. Nothing escaped her attention. Months of survival, observation, and strategic maneuvering had prepared her for this final confrontation. She had learned the rhythms of the castle, the hidden motives of those within it, and the unpredictable will of the Alpha King himself. Tonight, all of it would converge. The throne room awaited her. Massive doors, etched with ancient sigils and crowned with centuries of authority, loomed ahead. Omega's reflection shimmered faintly in the polished stone floor as she approached, her eyes steady, her posture commanding. This room had been a site of tests, betrayals, and revelations, but tonight it would witness her ascension. As she entered, the Alpha King rose from his throne, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betraying a mixture of respect, curiosity, and caution. The room was filled with assembled figures, loyalists who had endured alongside her, former conspirators now subdued by her intelligence and strategy, and those who had remained neutral, waiting to see which side would claim victory in the silent war of power. "You have grown," the Alpha King said, his voice calm yet weighted with authority. "From the labyrinth to betrayal, from shadowed corridors to confrontation, you have proven yourself in ways few could even comprehend. But the true test is now. The castle, its secrets, and its people will judge you as I have. Will you rise, or will you falter at the precipice of destiny?" Omega's gaze swept across the room. Every pair of eyes she met carried judgment, expectation, and fear. She understood that her ascension was not simply about survival. It was about earning authority, commanding respect, and mastering every aspect of this treacherous environment. And she would not falter. The first challenge came swiftly. A conspirator, one who had feigned loyalty for months, stepped forward, weapon drawn, intent clear in every movement. Omega's instincts took over. With the precision honed through countless encounters, she disarmed him, moving with fluid grace that was both mesmerizing and deadly. The crowd watched in tense silence, their breaths held as she neutralized threat after threat, not with indiscriminate violence, but with calculated control. The Alpha King observed quietly, noting each maneuver, each decision, each measure of composure. He had created trials of perception, betrayal, and confrontation. But this was different. This was recognition of Omega's mastery of the castle itself. As the confrontation reached its peak, a new threat emerged. Not physical, but political. Figures who had long plotted in the shadows, seeking to destabilize the Alpha King's authority, attempted to sway the assembly against Omega. But she was prepared. Using her deep understanding of alliances, motivations, and secrets, she exposed their schemes with meticulous precision. Every hidden whisper, every veiled threat, every subtle manipulation was revealed and neutralized, leaving the conspirators with no path to influence. The room erupted into a tense silence as Omega turned her gaze back to the Alpha King. She had survived the labyrinth, the betrayals, the conspiracies, and the direct confrontations. She had mastered perception, strategy, and combat. She had turned shadows into allies, threats into lessons, and danger into advantage. And now she stood not merely as a survivor, but as a force capable of shaping the destiny of the castle itself. The Alpha King's voice broke the silence. "You have done more than survive. You have mastered the elements of power, the currents of loyalty, and the dangers of the unseen. You are no longer merely an Omega. You are a leader, a strategist, and a force that commands both respect and fear. The castle recognizes this, and so do I." He rose fully from the throne, stepping forward, and for the first time, there was no veiled challenge in his gaze, only recognition. "From this night onward, the power within these walls is shared. You have earned it through every trial, every choice, every battle. The castle's shadows are yours to command as much as mine, and together we will ensure its strength endures." Omega stepped forward, her chest rising with confidence, her eyes ablaze with resolve. She had faced every danger, every betrayal, and every challenge the castle had thrown at her. Now she will step into her rightful place, not as a pawn, not as a subordinate, but as an equal, a leader whose presence could reshape destiny. Every shadow, Every flicker of torchlight, every subtle movement of the servants or guards was catalogued in her mind. Nothing escaped her attention. Months of survival, observation, and strategic maneuvering had prepared her for this final confrontation. She had learned the rhythms of the castle, the hidden motives of those within it, and the unpredictable will of the Alpha King himself. Tonight, all of it would converge. The throne room awaited her. Massive doors, etched with ancient sigils and crowned with centuries of authority, loomed ahead. Omega's reflection shimmered faintly in the polished stone floor as she approached, her eyes steady, her posture commanding. This room had been a site of tests, betrayals, and revelations, but tonight it would witness her ascension. As she entered, the Alpha King rose from his throne, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betraying a mixture of respect, curiosity, and caution. The room was filled with assembled figures, loyalists who had endured alongside her, former conspirators now subdued by her intelligence and strategy, and those who had remained neutral, waiting to see which side would claim victory in the silent war of power. "You have grown," the Alpha King said, his voice calm yet weighted with authority. "From the labyrinth to betrayal, from shadowed corridors to confrontation, you have proven yourself in ways few could even comprehend. But the true test is now. The castle, its secrets, and its people will judge you as I have. Will you rise, or will you falter at the precipice of destiny?" Omega's gaze swept across the room. Every pair of eyes she met carried judgment, expectation, and fear. She understood that her ascension was not simply about survival. It was about earning authority, commanding respect, and mastering every aspect of this treacherous environment. And she would not falter. The first challenge came swiftly. A conspirator, one who had feigned loyalty for months, stepped forward, weapon drawn, intent clear in every movement. Omega's instincts took over. With the precision honed through countless encounters, she disarmed him, moving with fluid grace that was both mesmerizing and deadly. The crowd watched in tense silence, their breaths held as she neutralized threat after threat, not with indiscriminate violence, but with calculated control. The Alpha King observed quietly, noting each maneuver, each decision, each measure of composure. He had created trials of perception, betrayal, and confrontation. But this was different. This was recognition of Omega's mastery of the castle itself. As the confrontation reached its peak, a new threat emerged. Not physical, but political. Figures who had long plotted in the shadows, seeking to destabilize the Alpha King's authority, attempted to sway the assembly against Omega. But she was prepared. Using her deep understanding of alliances, motivations, and secrets, she exposed their schemes with meticulous precision. Every hidden whisper, every veiled threat, every subtle manipulation was revealed and neutralized, leaving the conspirators with no path to influence. The room erupted into a tense silence as Omega turned her gaze back to the Alpha King. She had survived the labyrinth, the betrayals, the conspiracies, and the direct confrontations. She had mastered perception, strategy, and combat. She had turned shadows into allies, threats into lessons, and danger into advantage. And now she stood not merely as a survivor, but as a force capable of shaping the destiny of the castle itself. The Alpha King's voice broke the silence. "You have done more than survive. You have mastered the elements of power, the currents of loyalty, and the dangers of the unseen. You are no longer merely an Omega. You are a leader, a strategist, and a force that commands both respect and fear. The castle recognizes this, and so do I." He rose fully from the throne, stepping forward, and for the first time, there was no veiled challenge in his gaze, only recognition. "From this night onward, the power within these walls is shared. You have earned it through every trial, every choice, every battle. The castle's shadows are yours to command as much as mine, and together we will ensure its strength endures." Omega stepped forward, her chest rising with confidence, her eyes ablaze with resolve. She had faced every danger, every betrayal, and every challenge the castle had thrown at her.
Now she will step into her rightful place. Not as a pawn, not as a subordinate, but as an equal, a leader whose presence could reshape destiny.